Good morning. Starting the class on Project Pekudei Sichos. Pekudei Sichos, Chelek Tezayin, volume 16. The first Sicha on Parshas Pekudei, page 458. Sheingeret Filmol, we've discussed many times, as Rashi b'Pirusha ala Torah, in Rashi's commentary on the Torah, stellt sich up und is mefarish. Rashi comments and explains Yeder Inyan in welches felt biur in Bepshutish al Mikra. Any area that requires explanation to understand the simple and basic meaning of the Torah, Rashi spends some time, takes the time to explain it and clarify. It does sometimes happen that Rashi does not have an explanation. He'll say, I don't know, or something similar. So any area in Pekudei Shel Mikra, any area in the simple meaning of the verses of the Torah, Rashi will always comment, either explain, or will say that this is an issue that, while it requires explanation, I don't know the explanation. And therefore, the Shas is faran an inyan v'zetzich shver im pshat haksuvim. When there is something that on the surface seems to be difficult, and Rashi does not explain, or does not even bring it up, muss man sagen, eins von de zwei. So one of the following two scenarios is the case. Oder as Pekudei Shel Mikra is das melachatchila kein kasha nit. Either based on Rashi's understanding of the simple meaning of the Torah and of the way the Torah writes these verses, there really is no question to begin with. Oder adas is musbar al pi pirish Rashi telefonov. Or the answer can be understood based on something that Rashi already wrote previously, on an earlier verse in the Torah. So if there's a question, if there's something that requires clarification, Rashi clarifies. If there's something that Rashi doesn't know the answer to, he'll say, this requires clarification, I don't know the answer to it. And if there's something that Rashi doesn't mention at all, it's either because, from his perspective, there is no difficulty, or the difficulty is already clarified based on something that Rashi wrote previously. In the Itztika Sedrus, in the parshas of these weeks, is done inyan, was is nit muvan al pi pshuto shel mikra. There is something that seemingly, on the basic, according to the basic and simple pshat understanding of the Torah, is not understood. And Rashi makes no mention of it at all in any of his comments throughout these parshas. This is actually a very common question, and many of the commentators on the Torah ask this question. Rashi makes no mention of it. And thus is, in Parshas Vayakel, in the beginning of the parsha, the first parsha of this week's two parshas, Parshas Vayakel, der zelt the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu hat übergegeben zu Eden dem eibischen Zivui auf Trumas HaMishkan mit alle Pratim. We read about Moshe transmitting and telling the Jewish people all of the commandments that Hashem gave them with regard to constructing and donating towards the construction of the Mishkan. And he included in his transmission of these commandments all the details, every single detail that Hashem had told him previously, which we read about in the earlier parshas. Chumeitam truma, to take from them a contribution, bring in zav a kesef, that they should donate gold and silver for Malachas HaMishkan, for the construction. Und danach der Tzivui Fasis HaMishkan v'Kelov und Oich l'chol prateim, followed by the specifications, the exact details of how to construct the Mishkan, how to fashion the garments of the Kohen and the Kohanim and the Kohen Gadol, all of the utensils that were used in the Mishkan, and l'chol prateim, every single detail is now repeated. First Hashem tells it to Moshe in earlier parshas, and in this parsha Vayakel, Moshe repeats it word for word, almost word for word. Nachdem the zelt the Torah, and then afterwards the Torah again continues recounting wie die Eden haben gebracht in die Nedava from Malachas HaMishkan, how the Jews donated for the construction of the Mishkan. Und danach wird erzählt über Pratius, and then again the Torah seems to be repeating every single detail, wie die Chachmei Lev haben gemacht im Mishkan, how the architects, these wise people, and the designers created the Mishkan, the Yiriyos, all the coverings, and all the Klei Mishkan, all the utensils, the Parsha Seinu, and then in our Parsha, in Pekudei, the big Dikun, the garments of the Kohanim and the Kohen Gadol. Again, everything is repeated in detail. You would think that it would have been enough when the Torah took bekitzer, if the Torah would have very concisely stated, as Moshe hat übergegeben zu ihnen dem ganzen Zivui von Obersten, auf Nidus HaMishkan, that Moshe told the Jews everything that Hashem had told him. With regard to the donations and the construction. The details are already given and laid out very clearly in Hashem's words when he commanded Moshe to construct and to have everybody donate. In Truma, Tetzav, and Kisisa, in the three previous parshas of Truma, Tetzav, and Kisisa, all the details are already mentioned. Nothing is left out. Every single detail is included. So the Torah could have very simply said, Moshe told the Jews everything that Hashem had told him, and that should be followed by a very simple statement, that the Jews fulfilled everything that Hashem had commanded Moshe. Or we could have gone even shorter, even more concisely, without even saying that Moshe told everything to the Jews, everything that he had heard from Hashem, he had then transmitted to the Jews. He could have also, the Torah could have said it even shorter by saying, after the Torah describes the commandments that Hashem gave Moshe, it should say very simply there, that the Jews did everything that Hashem commanded Moshe. Without even spending the time to say that Moshe transmitted it to the Jews. Because it's obvious if the Jews did everything that Hashem had told Moshe, it's obvious that Moshe had transmitted it to them. As is indeed written, and this is the style it's used in other areas in the Torah. And in this Torah, in these several parshas itself, this style is used as well. Why do all the details need to be repeated? Both when the commandments are being transmitted to the Jews, and when the Jews actually carried out these instructions. Especially as in Onoiv Parshas Vayakel, at the very beginning of Parshas Vayakel, Zot Rashi. Rashi says very clearly, I have already explained and offered commentary regarding the donations that were given for the Mishkan and the actual construction of the Mishkan at the time that these instructions were commanded. So in Parshas Teruma, Tetzava, and Kisisa, Rashi spends a lot of time explaining and clarifying the various instructions for the Mishkan, for the construction and donations of the Mishkan. And Rashi now says, I'm not going to repeat myself because I already offered all of my commentary that is necessary. Implying that in our parshas, in Vayakel and Pekudei, nothing new is being taught that was not yet already known from the earlier parshas. And therefore Rashi says, I have nothing to add to my commentary here. So now our question is even stronger. If that's the case, the Torah for sure had no reason to repeat itself a second time, and certainly not a third time. Everything now is repeated in Vayakel and then in Pekudei, a total of 3 times after the original instructions were given in Truma, Tetzava, and Kisisa. This is a very, first of all, it's a famous question, but it's also a very basic question in the understanding of the Torah. And you need to, anybody reading the Torah will inevitably be faced with this difficulty, with this question. And as I mentioned, several Torah commentators, in fact, do ask this question and offer various answers. Rashi makes no mention of it. He doesn't ask the question and he doesn't explain. He makes no mention of it at the beginning of this repetition in Parshas Vayakel. in unser Sedra, and also he mentions nothing about it at the end when everything is being constructed in our parsha, in Parshas Pekudei. Befrat as lifnei in Parshas Kisisa. Earlier, last week's parsha, in Parshas Kisisa, stellt sich Rashi up to bewarnen, and the Iber Chazerim von Bloise gezählte Wörter. Rashi actually does comment and explain the repetition of individual single words. Das ist the Torah steht dreimal is Vasha Gedim B'Chalevim, when the Torah repeats the commandment 3 times not to cook a kid in its mother's milk. And it actually explains why the Torah repeats it 3 times. Once to tell us about the prohibition of cooking, of eating, and of benefiting from it. Based does an arichas hachpalas from ganze parshas. Over here we have full areas, full sections of the Torah, not just several words, but full parshas being repeated. When Rashi is the rov garnet mefarish, and Rashi says absolutely nothing about this. The Chura wollte man gekannt sagen als akoponim a chelek von der Scheile wird verantwortet auf die Pirshash in unser Parsha. Perhaps we can say that some of our question is explained in another part of Rashi's comment to this in this parsha. Often pasuk when the Torah says Betzalel ben Uri Gamer Asas Kol Asher Tziva Hashem Es Moshe, that Betzalel carried out the instructions as Hashem commanded Moshe. Zok Rashi. So there Rashi does explain, and he says, as Moshe Tziva le Betzalel Lases Tchila Kelim Machakach Mishkan. When Moshe was transmitting the instructions to Betzalel to construct the Mishkan, first he said to build the utensils, and then afterwards the actual Mishkan. Amalei Betzalel, so Betzalel had a question. It says, normally, the order is that when someone builds a home, first you build the actual structure, you build a house, and then you put the furniture inside. Amalei, Moshe responded, you're right, that is indeed how Hashem told it to me too. And then the Betzalel went on to first build the Mishkan, and then the furniture, and then the utensils that went inside. So perhaps based on this we can answer, that this is the reason for everything being repeated now again. By repeating everything in detail, it is evident that Betzalel switched the order. Von the Meifen is ausgestattet in Parshas Truma, he changed the order from the way Moshe was commanded to do so in Parshas Truma. Und gemacht für the Mishkan und danach der Kelim, and he created the Mishkan. He built and erected the Mishkan first, and then the utensils. So perhaps that's why everything is being repeated. So several reasons why this is not a sufficient answer. Aber, however, was lefriz noch alt nicht mehr vor was der Teure darf ausrechnen die Praten beim Sipur wie Moshe hat übergeben die Iden dem Zivu jetzt nicht Mishkan Mishkan Vekelov. This does not answer why Moshe had to repeat every detail of the instructions. It explains why when Betzalel did the construction it was repeated, perhaps, but it doesn't explain why Moshe himself had to repeat, or the Torah had to describe Moshe's repetition of every single detail. It also doesn't explain, so it for sure doesn't explain why Moshe had to repeat everything. But it also doesn't explain why the Torah had to repeat all the details when it came to the actual construction. And the Rabbi will tell us why. First of all, so dem is genug dem Chelek as über Torah was erzählt, als man hat zum ersten gemacht den Mishkan und danach hat man gegeben machen the Kelim. The Torah could have very simply said that when it came to the construction, they first made the Mishkan, they first made the structure, and then they made the utensils. But the Sipur wegen Asiyas Kelim, but when it comes to describing the details of how all the utensils are made, befrat Asiyas big de Kahuna, especially the garments of the Kehanim as described in our parsha, is in them Betzalel changed nothing. He did everything exactly as Moshe instructed him. So for what purpose is everything, or at least those details, being repeated? Beis v'ikar, the primary question that the Rebbe has on this answer is if the Torah wanted to inform us of the order of the construction, Frier the Mishkan and the Nacht Kelam, that first the Mishkan was constructed and then the utensils, is nicht nötig der Arichas von die Prati Advarim. The details are not necessary. They're not relevant. In the Asiyas, the Ermos, how it was made, and the volume, and the amounts, and so on. Nachmer, additionally, nach die Hachpolas HaPratim Hanal, after all these details are repeated, when it's kumt, b'Parshaseinu, in our parsha, in Parshas Pekudei, when the Torah says, Vayaviu es HaMishkan al Moshe, that they brought everything that was constructed to Moshe. Gimel rechent ois the Torah vidra amal ala prati advarim from Mishkan V'Kelev. The Torah now for the third time, as we said, repeats every single detail, which again, seemingly has nothing to do with the explanation that Bezalel changed the order. In Dalet, the fourth problem with this explanation, Nachtem, in the pasuk is a pasuk erst Messiah, and then the Torah concludes by saying that exactly as Hashem commanded Moshe, these were the exact instructions that the Jewish people followed, and they created a Mishkan. That should have been the only verse. We could have saved ourselves two whole parshas of Vayakel and Pekudei by just saying this one pasuk, this one verse at the end of our parsha. So, aside for this being a very strong question on the actual parshas and why there's a repetition, the big question that the Rebbe has is why Rashi makes no mention of this. Not as a question, and certainly not as an answer. Therefore, the Rebbe says that the answer is obvious. As we said earlier, that from Rashi's perspective, if something is so simple and so obvious, he will not even mention it. So der bir bezeh bepashtus, the explanation over here, very simply, or very obviously. Der Mishkan v'Kelev, the Mishkan and all its utensils, is from the inyanim hachi ikrim v'chavivim ba'idin. They are very central and extremely cherished by the Jewish people. Durch them is given because through the Mishkan, the divine presence dwelled among the Jews. Ubifrat, especially since der Mishkan wird angerufen, especially since the Mishkan is referred to, and as Rashi explains in our parsha, Mishkan Edus, a sanctuary of testimony. What kind of testimony is being brought by the Mishkan? Edus liYisrael, the Mishkan testifies for the Jewish people, Sheviter lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Hashem forgave them, Al Maisa HaEgel, for creating the golden calf, Sharei Hishra Shechinasei B'neihem, because God allowed for His presence to dwell among the Jews. That is the greatest proof and the greatest testimony that there was forgiveness and atonement for the golden calf. This offers us even more insight to the belovedness and how cherished this concept of the Mishkan is in general terms. The sin of the golden calf is given the chetach gadol klali. It was the greatest sin ever committed. It was the most general sin that was ever committed. General in the sense was that gering events from Gresten has to upon him for the Meibersten. It caused the greatest concealment of godliness. Bis to the Gzeres clear Achman al Tzlan Afiden. Also to the extent that Hashem threatened to annihilate the Jewish people, God forbid. Bis as afilu nach der slicha, even after the Jews were forgiven and atoned for this sin, had the Rebbe gesagt, in a day that I have to punish them for other sins, it will also include a punishment for the sin of the golden calf. So although there was forgiveness and there was atonement, a remnant of the blemish caused by the sin of the golden calf remains to this day, and whenever there's a punishment for other sins, it includes also a bit of a punishment for the sin of the golden calf. So that tells us something about how powerful, how strong the sin of the golden calf was. Und der Fon is moving Liedergisa. On the other hand, this also explains as der Mishkan was durch ihm is Hishra Shechinasei B'neihem, because the Mishkan caused God's presence to dwell among the Jews, is an inyan klali v'nayla admo. It is also a tremendous and exceptional concept, allowing the presence of God to reside among the Jews despite the sin of the golden calf. V'meil is verstandig. This means Ada as od di große chavivus from the Mishkan beim Eibishter bei Eden, this belovedness that Hashem and the Jewish people have for the Mishkan. Das is der Tam, was the Torah rechent ois alle prota Mishkan, is the reason why the Torah repeats and lists all the details of the Mishkan and Chazet Zeiber and repeats them einmal and nachamal, once, twice, chulu mit alle protim, because Hashem loves the Mishkan so much. The Yidden love the Mishkan. The Jewish people cherish the opportunity to communicate with God, to communicate with Hashem in the Mishkan, and appreciate the fact that they were forgiven for the sin of the golden calf. Because it's so beloved and cherished, the Torah repeats it once, twice, and then a third time. Und then Tam darf Rashi done it mefarish sein. And Rashi doesn't have to say anything about it here. But in Parshas Chayei Sarah, Rashi already said something similar in Parshas Chayei Sarah. Many parshas earlier, Rashi said something that sounds similar, that could be applied and is applied to this parsha as well. Then was noch dem mit the Torah itself wegen alle Moros von Eliezer eved Avram. The Torah describes all the events that had transpired with Eliezer, Avram's servant, B'shaychas as ein game bringing Rivka, when he went to bring Rivka from Padan Aram to marry Yitzchak. So after the Torah describes everything that had occurred with him, Chazet the Torah Iber Nachamal. The Torah then repeats the details in sein Erzählen as far Mishpachas Rivka. When Eliezer himself recounts the events that had transpired to Rivka's family, the Torah repeats it in exact detail, exactly and precisely as it did the first time it occurred. It's Rashi Masber, so over there it's also an obvious question, and Rashi there does explain. As does his Mitzad Chavivus from the Minyan, because that story is so cherished. Barum Amar Rav Acha, quoting a sage by the name of Rabbi Acha, Yafa Sichasun Shal Avdei Avos, the conversation of our ancestors' servants is greater, Lifnei HaMakom, before Hashem, Miterasun Shal Banim, than the Torah study of their descendants. This incident of Eliezer is repeated in the Torah, word for word. The same time that many details and specifics within the Torah have only been alluded to and are not mentioned clearly and in detail. So the Torah repeats the entire story of Eliezer in great detail, but so many of the 613 mitzvahs, for example, are only mentioned in passing, or they're hinted to, alluded to in specific wording within the Torah. So the conversation of Eliezer, the servant of Avram, is cherished and is considered greater before Hashem than the Torah study of Avram's descendants. Basement, therefore, this teaches us, as an inyan was is chaviv by Meibishtin in Torah, as an inyan was is chaviv by Meibishtin, something that Hashem cherishes, is the Torah das Kaifel mit alle pratim. The Torah will repeat it with all of its details. Hagamas kumt nitzu ken chidushim in them, even though there is nothing new being discovered in the repetition. And the same simply and obviously applies in our situation. The Torah repeats all the details of the donations and the building and the construction of the Mishkan. And like Rashi said earlier in Parshas Vayakel, there's nothing new here, and therefore there's no need for additional commentary. However, with this in mind, there's something that still requires clarification. From Rashi's language in Parshas Chayei Sarah, seemingly the opposite would be true. As their tam is nitshayach binyanenu, that the reason the story of Eliezer is repeated does not apply to our situation. Rashi over there says, Yafer sichason shal avdei avos miterason shal banim. The conversation of the servants of our ancestors is greater than the Torah study of their descendants. Meindach kipshutei, it seems, quite obviously, as by Terason Shel Banim, when it comes to the descendants' Torah study, was noch matan Torah, which occurs after the giving of the Torah, you find it as achavivus, and it does not have the same type of love, or God does not love it or cherish it as much. was to leave them soll bei sie sein, the meaning from full Torah, that the Torah should go to the extent of repeating it, wie bei Sichas und Shalav the others, as it does the conversations of the servants of our ancestors. Kann man doch nicht sagen, Adam Hezber bei Seis HaMishkan, was ist das Shalbonim? Since the construction of the Mishkan falls into the category of the Torah, of the descendants, of Avram's descendants, that would be the opposite of the conversation of the servants of our ancestors, and therefore it should not have been repeated. Their beer been them. However, there's a very simple explanation to this as well. The Kavanah from the Maimer was Rashi bringt, Yafa Sichasan Shalav de Yavos Miterasan Shabanim. When Rashi quotes this statement of our sages, of Rabbi, that the conversation of our ancestors is greater and more beloved than the Torah study of the descendants, is nicht zu madgish an dem Yisrin von Avdei Avos Avbanim. The point is not to show that the servants are greater than the descendants, nor herauszubringen dem Ilu v'chavivus lefamim von sichel agabe Torah, but rather the focus and the emphasis over here is on how sometimes conversation is greater than study. So it's not so much who's doing the conversation and who's doing the studying, but rather the actual study and the actual conversation. Sometimes study is not as great as, or not as cherished as conversation. The chilek zwischen dei kipshute is, what's the difference between conversation and study? Torah meant herois. Torah literally means instructions, tzivuyim, commands, v'dinim, and laws. Was der Eibishter hat angesagt, was und wie zu tun. Hashem tells us exactly how and what to do. Sicha meant, conversation over here means, a dibur, it means talk, was begoli or bipshutoi, on the surface, is es nit ken tzivu. It's not an instruction, it's not a commandment, nor a sipur. It's recounting an event. Was is metayar amatzav, describing a situation, a pasirung, an occurrence. A pa'ula, or something that was done, and many other similar types of descriptions. Und viders is by Eliezer Avram al. So when Eliezer, Avram's servant, was talking, was erzählt wegen Avram v'Yitzchak und was mit ihm hat getroffen. He tells Rivka's family everything that occurred with Avram and Yitzchak throughout their lives. The Kvitzas Haderech, and also how he traveled a journey of several days in one day. And how he met Rivka at the well and all the miracles that occurred. So as he's repeating this and as he's recounting these events, is there Maimer Madgish de Maila von Sicha. So Rabbi Acha in his statement says that this conversation is very special. Afilu von Avdei Avos, even if it's not being done by someone who's holy, but it's being done by a servant of our ancestors, is lefamim yafa, it can at times be greater from Terasan, Afilu Shalbonim, than the Torah study, even if the Torah study is being done by the descendants of our ancestors. So Rav Acha is basically giving you two extremes. He's giving you servants, he's giving you elite descendants of our ancestors, and he says that when it comes to the act of having a conversation versus the act of Torah, you would think that Torah is always greater than conversation, especially Torah when it's done by descendants of Avram. And over here he says that sometimes conversation, even when it's being done by a servant, is greater than Torah, even when it's being done by a Jewish person. This also explains the reasoning for all the repetition in our parsha. After we have all of the instructions and all the commandments in Parshas Truma and Tetzava, our parshas Vayakel and Pekudei are not offering any commandments or any instructions, wie und was zu tun, how and when to do it, and where. Und was on them wollte man es nicht gewusst. These are not commandments. These are not details that without them we wouldn't have known what to do. We would have very well known what to do. The Jews would have very well known how to build the Mishkan even without Parshas Vayakel and Pekudei. The Torah erzählt die Pratis über Baruch und Moshe Rabbeinu hat die alle Zivuyim von Eibishter wegen Malachas HaMishkan übergeben zu ihnen. The Torah does repeat all the details of how Moshe transmitted these instructions to the Jewish people. And then repeats it again in describing how they carried out these instructions. Das says, as is an inyan von sicha. Since these are not actual instructions, but rather a recounting of events, they fall into the category of conversation, of sicha. We bald as this sicha has been again the Mishkan, and because these conversations relate to the construction of the Mishkan, which we just said, is as a chaviv, since the Mishkan was so cherished, these conversations are also cherished, as to leave them kum diarichus. That's why it is elaborated with all the details in an oifen von kfula b'Torah. The Torah repeats it because it's so cherished. It's not teaching us anything new other than the fact that the Mishkan was so cherished, and therefore any conversation related to the Mishkan is equally cherished. And that's why the Torah repeats it. This also explains why Rashi, when he offers this explanation in Parshas Chayei bringt up the Shem von Balamayim Rabbi Acha. He quotes not only this statement, but also the name of the sage who offered this statement. As we've explained many times, so whenever Rashi quotes the name of the sage that offered this comment, it's because the individual, either his name or his personality, helps us understand his commentary. By quoting the name, by saying that it was Rabbi Acha, it helps us understand his statement that the conversation of the servants is greater. As the Hadgasha is not in Yisrin from Avdei Avis, it helps us understand that the advantage over here is not because it was said by the servants, Lagabe Banim, as opposed to sons or descendants. No, in the Ma'il von Sicha, that helps us understand how conversation is great. By quoting Rabbi Acha, by saying that it's Rabbi Acha, that helps us understand how conversation can sometimes have an advantage over Torah. And that will also help us understand in greater, with a greater appreciation, how conversation is greater than Torah. So what was special, what was unique about Rabbi Acha that helped us understand this? In Masechtas Yoma, gebracht the Braisa. The Gemara quotes a Braisa in Masechtas Yoma, in Tractate Yoma, which says as follows: Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, V'dibarta bam. The Torah says, as we read in the Shema, V'dibarta bam, you shall talk about it, bam v'loi b'tfila. V'dibarta bam yesh l'cha reshus l'daber v'loi b'dvarim acherim. So two things that the words V'dibarta bam teach us. First of all, the Braisa says that any involvement and constant engagement that we have in conversation should be with regards to Torah and not prayer, and also Torah and not other matters. We'll see soon what these other matters refer to. Rabbi Acha Omer, so in a continuation of this Braisa, Rabbi Acha, the same Rabbi Acha says, V'dibarta bam you shall make these words of Torah permanent and not temporary. When you study Torah and when you recite and you share words of Torah, that should be your primary focus in life. Everything else is temporary. Your Torah study should be permanent, everything else temporary. Because Rav Acha only includes the obligation, undi shlila, and also the negative side, b'negei Torah, with regards to Torah study. When Rabbi Acha interprets the verse v'dibarta bam, he says that it implies that we should make Torah permanent and not temporary. He does not reject completely outright other matters. As the Tanakama, the one who seems to be arguing with in the Braisa, who outright forbids other matters, is mashmas by dvarim acherim, is loit Rabbi Acha nitchal the shlila. It appears that according to Rabbi Acha, dvarim acherim, other matters are not rejected. Aber zu den können sagen, dass das Rabbi Acha is da heter auf Dvarim Acherim Betelim. But can we say that Rabbi Acha says that Dvarim Betelim, trivial matters, matters that have no relevance to Torah, are permitted, are allowed? So there's got to be something in between what we would call trivial matters, or Dvarim Betelim, or words of folly, even to take it to a further extreme, and these Dvarim Acherim, these other matters that the Rabbi Acha is not completely rejecting. Nor der beer in them is. The explanation is, Rabbi Acha is madgish. Rabbi Acha over here emphasizes, as benegel divrei Torah, when it comes to Torah study, is achiv tmidi ubehechlet as is darv zayin v'dibarta bam, that there is a constant obligation to engage in Torah study. Un keva un it arai, it must be permanent rather than temporary. Aber benegel dvarim acherim, but with regard to other matters, kemen zein it shelo zayin behechlet, they can't be completely rejected. There are other matters that can be included in the category of sicha, as we said earlier, of conversation. It's not matters of folly, it's not trivial matters. But it's also not actual Torah. What does actual Torah mean? There's no instructions and commandments and laws. Nor diburim v'sipurim. There's conversation, storytelling, vinyana hiseirus, and words of inspiration. Ubimela ken zayin az asicha ich yafu. So therefore, this type of conversation can be greater because az asicha vas zayin yafu miterasan, and sometimes it can be even greater and more cherished than actual Torah study. Aber von deswegen, nevertheless, is dafke mir get Torah did serious and kevaval ta'as amarai. The commandment that something needs to be made permanent rather than temporary applies only to actual Torah study. Obviously, even for a child, a 5-year-old child learning Torah for the first time, that we must always remember, and learn and constantly repeating and studying the Hayros, the instructions, the Divrei Torah, the words of Torah, what we have to do, what we're obligated to do, what we may not do, so Rav Acha does not completely reject other matters, because from his perspective, other matters can include conversation that has benefit. And depending on the subject, it is likely perhaps, especially in the subject of the Mishkan, as we're discussing in this parsha, that it's greater than actual Torah study, because of how beloved and cherished it is both to Hashem and the Jewish people. And that's why Rashi doesn't make any mention of it, because it's already very clearly stated in his commentary in Parshas Chayei Sarah. Now, to understand all this from the perspective of Chassidus, in these two sedres was where an Ibr gechazet alle prate hamishkan v'kelav. In these two parshas of Vayakel and Pekudei, in which all the details of the Mishkan are repeated, we find two general points. Aleph, first of all, the nedivas halev von den Juden, the generosity of the Jewish people. Was they haben gebracht, they donated, and without wasting any time, alle nötige Sachen fahren Mishkan, all the necessary components of the Mishkan. When they were extremely generous of heart, as the Torah says. And there came a point where an announcement had to be made, al yasu oid malacha, that there should be no more done. Which is given by there was plenty and too much. So that's the first point, that there was a lot of generosity. And the second point, as the chachmei leiv, these wise people, or who are wise of heart, as the Torah says, they fulfilled and followed through with Hashem's instructions, and they created the Mishkan, all of the utensils, in the exact detail as Hashem commanded, the way Hashem commanded Moshe. So those two details, the generosity and the action, are what's highlighted in these two parshas of Vayakel and Pekudei. Ubipratis, we said more specifically, Although they're two separate points, but they actually do come together. When the Jews donated, they were actually fulfilling a commandment, similar to a servant. So God commanded them, Hashem commanded them to that anybody that is generous of heart should contribute. Take from them a donation, a contribution. So by donating, they were actually fulfilling an obligation too. They were fulfilling Hashem's instructions. The flip side is that when it came to the actual construction, the Torah uses the word leiv, heart, chachmei leiv, they were wise of heart, and the people that carried out these instructions, these architects and designers and builders, were also using their heart. So on one hand, there's heart that leads to generosity, and on the other hand, there's heart that leads to actual fulfilling the physical construction and performing the physical construction. And on the other side, on the other hand, even the generosity, which is an expression of the heart, is also a fulfillment of a physical, practical, actual, down-to-earth instruction of Hashem. Pizes move on. Although earlier we said that Rabbi Acha's emphasis is not so much on who's doing the conversation, the fact that it was a servant is secondary, but over here the Rebbe actually combines both concepts. That there was sicha, there was conversation, and there was avdei avis, there was servants. Sicha is verbunden mit leiv. Conversation relates to heart. But sicha, when the term sicha or conversation is used, that refers to prayer. Sicha, as we know, often refers to davening, to prayer, as our sages have taught us many times. Und tefillah is the avodah shebeleiv. Prayer, as mentioned in the Gemara, is the service of the heart. So that's the first component, sicha, as expressed in the generosity of the Jews through their heart. Und eved is madrigim inyan from kima mitzvahs. The term eved, or servant, highlights the fact that the Jews fulfilled the commandments and in general the performance of mitzvahs. That's what a servant is really all about. Mekayim zayin tzivu yad, and fulfilling the instructions given to him by his master. Was das seinen die zwei inyanim? These two components of our parsha, nidvas hamishkan, the donations, and nidvas halei von Eden, when the Jews were generous of heart, inyan hasicha, that's the conversation component. Und der kiyum hatzivin von asiyas hamishkan, the actual fulfillment of the instructions in constructing the Mishkan, Eved, that's where the component of Eved, of servant, comes in. When as darv zayin the hiskalus von adi beida, we must have a fusion, a combination of these two components. As the kiyum ha-mitzvahs, when we perform mitzvahs, inyan Eved, as servants, darv zayin zusammen mit nedivas alev, that must come together with being generous of heart. Und in dem nedivas alev, when within this generosity of our hearts, darf sich anhören, we must also appreciate, as das is mitzad tzivu yakadosh baruch hu, that we're doing all of these mitzvahs because they were commanded to us by Hashem.